Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, control your life.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the 817 podcast. EJ and I are super excited. Today we have a really special guest, an associate professor of geography at TCU, Kyle Walker. Kyle studies migration patterns of people, not birds. And we're really excited to have him sit down with us and talk about the census data we've gotten so far from the U.S. Census and how that applies to Fort Worth, as well as just what it means to be a city, what kind of growth is good growth, and how Fort Worth looks at the next maybe decade of how can it grow well, and how can it grow in a diverse and equitable way. So we're really excited to have him on, and we really hope you enjoy this conversation.
All right, so a little bit of background about me. I'm Kyle Walker. I teach at TCU. I'm associate professor of geography there and work with the Center for Urban Studies. And basically my background professionally is in what I'll call population geography. I'm interested in where people live, why they live where they do, and how population change characterizes neighborhoods. And so, thinking about what I tend to be known for professionally, honestly, is a little bit more on the technical and methods side of things. I've got a new book coming out that I just released for free on my website called Analyzing U.S. Census Data, Methods, Maps, and Models in R. And so if you're sort of statistically or computationally inclined, you can go in there and learn how to crunch all the census numbers you want and
Wow.
figure out some of this stuff.
That's awesome.
So yeah, if you guys want the link for that, I'll send it to you. You can put it in the show notes. In terms of my Fort Worth story, I've been living here now a little over 9 years. I live in the Foster Park neighborhood, just southwest of TCU. And lived a couple of different neighborhoods in the city. We could talk about that a little bit, kind of my observations. But we've been living in Foster Park a couple of years now. And I'm originally from Oregon, so not a native Texan. Never even really lived in a southern location until we moved here. So grew up in Oregon, lived in Minneapolis for 6 years for grad school. Then my wife Molly got a promotion in her company, which took us to New York City. We spent a couple years living in Queens. I worked in Manhattan for a couple years, and then got the job at TCU, came down here. So
I feel like you've gotten like a full scope of American geography, of just like getting to experience different cities.
Yeah, we really have. It's interesting because there'll be sort of cultural nuances that you pick up on, not to overly stereotype, but there is some degree of that in terms of how you interact with people. In Minnesota, there's this thing called Minnesota Nice and people will say that up there, they'll poke fun at themselves and say, it'll seem like someone's being friendly with you, but they're actually not being friendly with you. And then you go to New York and it's really the opposite of that because people just express how they're feeling. And you kind of have to adapt to that or else you're going to get swallowed up. And so then we moved down to Texas here, been here 9 years.
Well, I think I would love to just dive into what the data is saying about Fort Worth. We on the pod, we often talk about the loop, and we also talked about the dynamics of Tarrant County and Fort Worth as a city being spread out all the way up 35 North, how it impacts voting, how it impacts where people choose to live. What is some information that you wish was more out there about Fort Worth that you are either working on or have identified?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really interesting. There's a lot to talk about with respect to Fort Worth because Fort Worth as a city, at least as I've found living here, it's a difficult city to kind of characterize and talk about neatly in a box, and that kind of goes without saying for any place, but with respect to a Fort Worth, if someone were to say, well, what's Fort Worth like? You kind of have to scratch your head a little bit and say, well, it's actually this massive sprawling city that has older urban neighborhoods that are, pushing 150 years old, to sort of 1960 suburbs, but within sort of the urban core. If you count kind of the loop as the urban core, and then it has brand new subdivisions, like the neighborhood that I moved to when I first moved here. I mean, we were living in an apartment on top of someone's house in Queens, which was great. But then I got a job at TCU. We started looking at real estate out here, and you look at some of those neighborhoods as we did. The tollway wasn't even built yet, but down off the tollway, you could seriously get a house this big for this price? Are you kidding? So we moved there. And so you have all of those kind of different types of places. And I mean, even if you go out towards Alito, Walsh Ranch, those areas, that's farmland, that's countryside, and that's still Fort Worth. And so, that's one of the things when I'm explaining Fort Worth to kind of people from the outside. It really depends kind of what Fort Worth you're talking about. Circling back a little bit is talking about some of the numbers. It's been interesting. There are a couple of different stories that have been coming out, and I've been interviewed a couple times by Star Telegram, Fort Worth Report. So I'll just touch on a couple of the items that people have been most interested in. One was Fort Worth's sort of ill-fated ascendancy to the 12th largest city in the country, which turned out to be false. So the U.S. Census Bureau puts out data on a regular basis, and they put out a bunch of different surveys. And some of the major ones they put out include the Decennial U.S. Census, which is the big one. And then there's also the American Community Survey, which is where you get all your demographics like poverty, internet access, income, that kind of thing. And then you have the Population Estimates Program, and this is only a small sampling of all of the data sets available, but the population estimates are based on the previous decennial census and then projected forward using births, deaths, and migration numbers that the census get. And so the population estimates, and it was an unofficial estimate that census released, but people were so hungry for 2020 data because the 2020 census had been delayed for a variety of reasons, kind of government interference and the pandemic, most notably, that people here kind of latched onto it and said, hey, and it was a talking point. I would go to an event and people would say, hey, did you know Fort Worth's leapfrog Jacksonville for 12th place? And this was a major story that was sort of pointing to the city's ascendancy, if you will, if you were to read that narrative. And that turned out to not be true. Again, the city is still growing massively. I don't have a clean projection on it, but we're going to hit 1 million sooner rather than later. We're going in that direction. And so I think that's one piece that's interesting, but also thinking about, well, where is that growth happening? And we can go into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so, raw growth is an interesting story to think about, and we can talk about that. And the other is the composition, the population composition. And we still don't have a lot of details yet. I think it's interesting when you look at the data that did come out in August, and that's the redistricting data, which is a slice, so to speak, of the decennial 2020 census that mostly includes information on voting age population and sort of very general race ethnicity categories. And that's pretty much what you get. And then population counts. So the full 2020 census data set's not coming out till at the earliest summer of next year. And so because, race ethnicity is basically the demographics that we can get out of this data set, that drives a lot of the conversations that people have been having in the local media and the national media. And so, those are, I think, are the two big pieces that we could delve into a little bit. Because that's, that's the data that we have so far.
So since Fort Worth has redistricting coming up this fall, but we don't get the full census data until next summer, how much of a disparity are we going to see between what we have now and what we're going to base redistricting off of versus what we might see come out in summer 2022?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the redistricting data gives us really the core information, I believe, that's sort of needed
Okay.
to try to ensure fairness under the Voting Rights Act. And so the other stuff that comes out in 2022 will be of interest to city planners, business people, demographers, most certainly. The information that we have should reasonably be enough to kind of get us going. If we're thinking about representation, again, with respect to those categories that people are talking about. I mean, it is an interesting thing to think about, though, right? Because race, ethnicity, because that's the primary category that gets tracked of many, many different categories that matter with respect to this redistricting data. Inevitably, that'll be kind of figuring here is potentially what's most important, along with total population. So, I don't think the 2022 data will. It'll certainly bring some nuance in. It'll give us more information about sort of age profiles, home ownership, rental housing, that sort of thing. But I think we probably have enough information to really get started on that process.
You mentioned, I want to go the composition. Can you kind of define how composition works and what is the composition of Fort Worth currently saying? I know you had the Fort Worth report quote around the suburbs and how the suburbs are moving quicker, having I guess, a faster change of diversity in the suburbs than the inner core, which was good insight for us because I think I think it's easy for us to always stereotype suburbs as white flight and the idea that that's what's happening. And so I would just love for you to kind of dive into what you kind of explained there and what that looks like.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've got up on my other screen over here, I was just kind of running through a bunch of maps to make sure that I have it all accurate. But there's some pretty interesting stories coming out about this nationally, and I looked at this a little bit. And just kind of going back to the general idea there, the general point, and to contextualize it, I think for your listeners, this idea of white flight and what that is, going all the way back to when we think about the growth of suburbs in the United States, really kind of post-World War II, even before the end of World War II, New Deal programs to try to pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. We're really thinking about promoting home ownership, specifically single family home ownership, and we had space to build outside of cities. And so, we built a bunch of interstate highways all around the country, subsidized mortgages for returning GIs after the war, in a way that, heavily slanted, the ability of people to get those mortgages toward the white population and disadvantaged non-white residents of cities. And so you had that component of it, along with, various events kind of through the 50s and 60s in the civil rights movement, without doing too big of a deep dive into the history, but we saw kind of large scale, especially in many cities through the Midwest, Northeast, large scale outmigration of white populations from urban neighborhoods. And so the stereotype of the suburb comes from that. The idea of kind of homogenous population due to those demographic movements, and also homogenous sort of mass produced housing. And, to a degree, there is still truth to that. And you are going to find neighborhoods that look a lot like that. And you're going to see those neighborhoods here in DFW to this day. But really, it's a whole lot more complicated than that. If you look at where the neighborhoods that are the most diverse, and by diverse, I'm defining that as sort of evenness of different groups by race and ethnicity here, where you're, very likely to have, say, a non-Hispanic white family, or a mixed race family, a Hispanic family, an Asian family, all in the same block. Where do those neighborhoods tend to be found? They tend to be found outside the 820 loop. And, where we're seeing them especially is in some of those new developments, again, south off the tollway going toward Crowley. A lot of those neighborhoods, very, very diverse. And then also north up 35W. It gets a little bit less diverse toward Colleyville, Keller, Southlake, but thinking the Fort Worth part of that, very, very diverse. And inside the core, and I had talked about this with Brooke at the Fort Worth Report. You'll see some demographic shifts, but those neighborhoods just statistically tend to be more segregated and less diverse. And so, I mean, it's interesting because you can say, the urban core of Fort Worth, very diverse. That's true on aggregate. But if you go neighborhood by neighborhood, that diversity tends to pale in comparison with what we see in the more suburban parts of Fort Worth. And so that's interesting to see.
Yeah, there was a Star Telegram article in the Sunday paper that we talked about yesterday that kind of like went alongside that story from the Fort Worth Report, talking about how there's a lack of middle income housing in the urban core. And because of that, you have your, predominantly upper middle class neighborhoods, and then you have lower class neighborhoods, and there's really not much mixing of the two. And it feels like that goes hand in hand with the idea that if people are there in the middle and they don't want to go into a neighborhood that they see as lower income or having worse schools or whatever reason they find it unfavorable, then they go to these new neighborhoods that are just outside the loop.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up something here because I wanted to see, looking at specifically, again, so I've got like a map up here that I'm processing. I can show you guys sometime. Looking at, say, neighborhoods in Tarrant County that lost population since 2010, near North Side, and really sort of near South Side, east of Granbury. That's where we're seeing population losses, generally speaking, in raw terms. Most neighborhoods in Tarrant County grew. But if you look at, interestingly enough, kind of population composition, and this is something that I had talked about in some of the articles, if you look at some of the historically Hispanic neighborhoods in the city, like the near South Side and the near North Side, those neighborhoods, just in raw numbers, are losing Hispanic residents. If you look at the historically Black neighborhoods in Fort Worth, those neighborhoods are also, generally speaking, losing Black residents. And where we see the biggest growth in those groups tends to be in these suburban areas. Now, it's not a clean comparison because, some of these suburban neighborhoods had no houses 10 years ago, and now they're blanketed with houses. So by definition, they're going to grow. But that tends to be the trajectory that we're seeing. With respect to the white population, and the New York Times did a really interesting analysis of this right after the census came out. If you look at neighborhoods where the non-Hispanic white share of the population is increasing, and so in raw numbers, it's increasing in a lot of places, but in terms of the share, areas that are becoming whiter, if you will. In Fort Worth, it's basically downtown, West 7th, and near South Side, and that's it.
Yeah.
So everywhere else is becoming sort of less white, if you will. And it's the same story over in Dallas. You look at Deep Ellum, Uptown, that's pretty much it. And there's a bigger story here that's interesting. And I talked with Brooke about this. Part of it is, that the non-white population of Texas is much younger and it's growing faster than the white population, but also people's relationship to racial categories is changing. And so there's been some really interesting stuff coming out saying, hold up a second, what white and Black and Hispanic mean in 2020 is different from what they meant in 2010. And so you can't just count the numbers and expect them to mean the exact same thing. And so, that's something that we could talk about too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Breaking that down is way more challenging than, we have time for today. But I think when we're looking at those numbers, that's just something I think in general that's important to think about, because we have, again, more and more people claiming mixed race in the census than they were 10 years ago, and certainly than they were 20 years ago. And so that's going to have an impact on any numbers as you break them down.
What is I mean, if you could maybe pull away from the numbers and the maps and go from like your personal point of view on things, what are some things that just overall that frustrate you or you feel like are negatives when it comes to urban development? And then what are some things that you maybe try to aspire and persuade more people to see?
It's an interesting question. I've often kind of been the numbers guy. Like I'll say, here's the numbers, y'all go make the decisions. But there are a couple of pieces that I think are interesting to me. And so I'll loop back a little bit to the narrative around population growth in Fort Worth and, all of the excitement about moving up to 12th place. And, when I see something like that, I always, again, a lot of people are moving to Fort Worth. That's raising the national profile of the city. And I think in general, that brings a lot of positives, but I don't think it means exactly what a lot of people think it means. There's, in thinking about sort of demographic change, there's a really, really common thing that you hear a lot of people do where they equate population growth with desirability. And basically say, look, this area is growing, therefore, people must want to live there more than these other places that aren't growing as fast. And as a demographer, I look at that and I say, well, that's not exactly true. If I could live anywhere in the world, I'd live in Maui. I don't live there. Why don't I live there? There's it's the most desirable location in the world to me, but I'm not moving there. Why is that? It's because migration and population growth, it doesn't perfectly overlap with the desirability of a place. People move to places for a lot of reasons. Sometimes, it's kind of an equation of, what's affordable, what's available. Maybe they were pushed out of a place or displaced from a location, where they wanted to live and ended up having to go somewhere else. I'm not saying I can put numbers directly on the extent to which that's happening in Fort Worth, but, it's often, it's easy to, take a look at, Fort Worth is 13th or 12th largest, city, but I show this to my students all the time. I say, do you all actually know what the boundary of Fort Worth looks like? And they don't know. And so I show them on Google Maps, and it's extraordinarily complicated, and it reaches all the way north to the Motor Speedway. It reaches all the way east to the airport. Now it's like reaching out into Wise and Parker counties to the west. And so it's not a clean comparison to other cities. If you look at some of the other really big cities on that list, Jacksonville is massive in terms of its land area. San Antonio is another one, also massive in terms of its land area. And, in turn, its population growth in Fort Worth is a function of the fact that it actually can grow, that it can sprawl out on the edges. And, that's just an interesting thing to me coming from, having lived in a place like Minneapolis, which is a really different type of center city, where the actual center city is very small. Minneapolis has about 400,000 people in it, and the physical footprint of the city is very small because it's completely surrounded by suburbs. So Minneapolis, the city, can't sprawl, whereas Fort Worth can. And so perhaps that's a little bit of a long-winded way of, coming back to say, okay, population growth, again, I think there's an element to which that we can celebrate that. If we're moving up the rankings, that's great. What kind of growth is this, though? Is this growth that is sustainable? or is it growth that is putting additional pressures on, our local resources and isn't necessarily contributing back to the overall sort of economic growth and development of the city? A question I've gotten multiple times is, okay, we're building like crazy up along 35W to the north. Are we actually subsidizing economic development for other cities? Are those people that live up in Denton County, parts of Fort Worth, actually commuting to downtown Fort Worth? I haven't done a complete look at this, but sort of, an early look suggests that they aren't necessarily doing that. They're going east, or they're maybe going out to Las Colinas. They might be going to the airport. They might be working up, in the Alliance area, which is Fort Worth. But, is growth in the city? It's interesting, right? Because if you're building and building out in suburban Fort Worth, is that at the expense of the urban core? Is the city sort of, again, I don't know if, I don't know exactly what the right word is, but is it potentially kind of just to kind of, promote population growth? Yeah. Is that potentially detracting from some other areas?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in terms of especially school districts, and there are a lot of people that quote unquote or like contribute to Fort Worth but don't contribute to Fort Worth ISD. And even just seeing how really non-diverse Fort Worth ISD is, with 85% black and brown students, that doesn't come anywhere close to matching the demographics of Fort Worth as a whole. And right. So like how resources are potentially being pulled away from Fort Worth ISD to your Kellers or Alitos or other places that are a little bit further out. Like, is Fort Worth ISD being left behind because of that? Which is maybe a similar thing as to what's happened in Dallas over the years, as that has grown, but not in a way that contributes to public school systems also.
And that was one of my kind of, like, I feel like what struggles with Dallas is everyone moved to Plano, Plano, McKinney. And so all the talent of resources, like, exile, they come to work and they leave, and then the inner loop is actually like almost lost its, I don't know, a true identity, I guess. And I don't know, it's not as enjoyable maybe as Fort Worth still is. We're still building out our second loop, it looks like, and we're still building out like our Plano and stuff like that. And so I guess, yeah, what's your kind of, I guess, take on that with schools? And then is that good, I guess? Because like a part of me wants to say like we should maybe, has any city ever just cut the amount of mass? They said like, hey, this actually ain't all one city. This is two cities. This is Alliance, Texas, and Fort Worth, Texas. Welcome to the game. And like, hey, let's do that. Has any city done that?
That's a great question. I think, oh gosh, I'd hesitate to sort of throw stuff out there. In some cases, you'll see that sort of thing maybe in an antagonistic sort of way, where an affluent sort of part of a bigger city will maybe secede from the bigger city, if you will. And so there's that part of it, but oftentimes it goes in the opposite direction, really, where, big cities will consolidate and annex areas. And that, I think, tends to be, the direction that we're seeing it go here. There's a lot of interesting points, I think, to touch on there. The schools piece and the talent piece. The schools piece, and, I'm not an expert in that area. I mean, my kids are in Fort Worth ISD. We really, really like it. But it was confusing to me moving here. And I mean, again, as a new parent, you're always sort of navigating this, but we moved to Fort Worth, and it was in the Crowley school district where we originally moved. And that, at first, I was trying to understand exactly, why that was and why that was the case. But it is a really interesting point, I think, to think about, because there is that disconnect between the actual boundaries of the school district and where a lot of the growth is taking place. I mean, if you look at the boundaries of Fort Worth ISD and where really the explosive growth is happening in terms of new suburbanization, it's, those are Fort Worth addresses, but it's Keller ISD, it's Crowley ISD, it's Eagle Mountain, Saginaw ISD, it's Aledo ISD. It's a lot of those, other kind of outlying school districts. And, I even said, growth for the sake of growth, I'm somewhat skeptical of. So that's, a bigger topic, but it's interesting sort of that segue into the talent piece and what you kind of observe, with respect to the geography of jobs, in Dallas, Fort Worth, and how Fort Worth figures there, something that, I've gotten to know the area, but I'm be the first to admit that my job as a professor is kind of weird and in some ways is detached from the general labor market.
Yeah.
It's kind of a unique, profession to be, an employer. The labor market is a national one. It's not a local one. And so observing what's going on elsewhere, I'll hear from my students who are looking for jobs. And there's this disjuncture that I'll hear from them with respect to sort of Fort Worth, where they see it as very livable and a very enjoyable place, to live. They would love to raise a family here and that kind of thing. And where some of the jobs that they're interested in tend to be located. A lot of my students end up getting, pretty cutting edge technical skills, and they want to go find jobs where they can apply that. And often it'll take them out to Plano, or it'll take them out to Las Colinas, Irving, if they're lucky, because that's closer than going all the way to Dallas or going up to Frisco. I mean, you look at what's going on in Frisco nowadays, with respect to basically kind of high tech, highly educated jobs growth. It's crazy. And, my students will tell me, well, kind of like to stay in Fort Worth, and maybe they do try, but eventually it just becomes unsustainable to do that kind of commute. Now, granted, things are changing through COVID and remote work. I've talked to several people now, and again, it's anecdotal, who are based over in Collin County, but they're able to live in Fort Worth and only have to go into the office one day a week or something like that. But again, thinking about the trajectory of those things is important. If you look at Fortune 500 companies, we have American Airlines, but that's not anywhere near the urban core. We've lost some fairly major employers here in Fort Worth over the last few years. And if you look at, where a lot of, those jobs, thinking about really kind of well-paying jobs are located, a lot of it's going on along the Dallas North Tollway over there.
Yeah.
And I've didn't ever spend very much time over there until, my daughter started playing select soccer, and all the games are out on that side of the Metroplex. And so we drive on the George Bush and the Sam Rayburn all the time, and just observing what's going on out there. We don't necessarily have parallels to that on this side of the Metroplex, at least not yet.
Yeah, one of the comments we say is we better be afraid DFW doesn't turn into DFP, Dallas, Frisco, Plano. So, it's like we think, luckily we got the airport in the middle and all that, but like that, what you were saying about the technical growth in Frisco and the rapid growth in those areas, it feels kind of like Fort Worth could be sidelined. But like you said, living here is great. And can we be a knowledge-based worker hub where like, working from home, this is the city, like that's our thing. Like that's, people would want to live here maybe, because it's such a affordable, slower pace, easy to get around. So I don't know. Those are just different marketing things we've talked to with like other people around, like how to brand and position Fort Worth.
And I mean, it's an interesting question, because of course you see everybody's trying to be Austin, and sometimes I don't know if Austin wants to be Austin anymore, because of some of the changes that have happened down there with respect to affordability and everything that goes with that. But of course, there's so much more to the equation. I think there is a risk too, if a city is sort of chasing, hey, we got this big California company to relocate here, and they're really only tailoring themselves to one part of the labor market and not paying attention to making sure that everybody, at every wage level, in every situation, can live safely and comfortably and have access to opportunities. That's something that I do think in some of these narratives gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. And, not everybody needs to be the next Austin. But I do think there is often a narrative around that because basically you have sort of your top tier San Francisco, New York of cities with respect to kind of, big business and that sort of thing. You got LA too. LA is kind of a unique place, but if you're thinking about kind of tech sector finance, San Francisco, New York are where you're going, but they've become kind of so expensive that you have sort of cities trying to position themselves and be that next piece. A big part of that, you saw it in cities chasing HQ2 for Amazon a couple years ago, and I understand the excitement about that. Even though it sort of seemed like Amazon ended up picking, where they wanted to go, anyway. But again, just sort of as an aside there, it's a bigger story. You can get easily caught up into trying to, chase these high dollar employers, building jobs for highly educated populations. But, for a city to thrive, it needs opportunity for everybody. And that's just something I think sometimes gets lost in the narrative a little bit.
Do you think so? Like 2020 census obviously happened too close to the pandemic starting to maybe see the effects of remote workplaces and trying to become like a knowledge-based worker hub. What do you feel like come 2030 census? Do you think we will see any trends to where cities that try and position themselves to attract remote workers will be the ones experiencing growth as opposed to chasing HQ2 or Nashville Landing, Oracle, and companies like that?
So I love this question. I don't have a clear answer to it, but I am so interested in that. And I think, I think it's interesting because you're right. 2020 census. So census day is technically April 1st, but some people fill it out before. And that was really just 2 weeks after the pandemic started going. So we didn't see sort of large scale demographic impacts from that yet. And even so, we'll see in the next few years if there's sort of a demographic rebound. Because again, you think about how geographically the pandemic has evolved. New York City gets hit the hardest. The national media assumes it's because it's the densest city in the US and assumes that COVID spreads because of density. And now there are all these think pieces about people escaping New York City to avoid pandemics. And it turns out it was sort of a different set of circumstances. And now the pandemic is worse in lower density areas rather than high density areas, due to, in some cases, a whole set of social circumstances that run in parallel with density, but are not because of density per se.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean moving forward? I think it'll be interesting to see, obviously, with variants coming up and companies starting even pushing back further, return to the office type movements, what's going to happen in the next couple of years, where Fort Worth can potentially figure, it's interesting to think about, because, what makes an interesting location for people to work remotely? So I'm from Oregon. my wife grew up in a town called Bend, which is in the mountains, and Bend has become a pandemic boom town. It already was trending in that direction, but Bend is, in my opinion, one of the most naturally beautiful places in the entire country. Mountains, skiing, huge trees, and massive numbers of in-migrants from the Bay Area who, now can work remotely. They're still relatively close to the Bay Area, so they can get there if they need to. And what Bend has going for it is, housing prices are skyrocketing right now, but it's cheaper to live there than the Bay Area.
Yeah.
But it has a lot of natural beauty. And so when you have sort of pandemic remote workers, is Fort Worth competing with those areas that have, immense natural beauty? Probably not. So there are other pieces, is it cultural amenities? Because people still are going to want that. Even if you're working remotely, you're not going to want to just sit in your house all the time. You're still going to want cultural amenities, and you're going to want affordability. You're going to want kind of equality of opportunity, within a community. Those are all still things that people are going to value. And it's interesting. Again, I feel like I'm talking around it a little bit because I don't necessarily have the answers. You see a city like Tulsa that has been giving $10,000 grants to people that relocate there to work remotely, and you wouldn't think Tulsa as this sort of, competitor with a Lake Tahoe or a Bend, Oregon as a remote work destination, but we'll see if that strategy pays off for them.
Yeah.
If you can provide I'm not even saying Fort Worth should do that, but that's just an example of a strategy that I found interesting. But I'll be fascinated to see kind of, how that happens. I think potentially the path forward for Fort Worth, we have a lot of advantages. We're in the 4th largest metro area in the country. That's growing very fast. Yes, there's internal competition that happens, and the fact that Dallas is an international name, whereas Fort Worth is not. But at the same time, I think, we as a city can, grow with the rest of the Metroplex, and ultimately benefit from some of those in-place opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's a massive advantage having, you can get a direct flight to anywhere in the country
100%.
from DFW or Love Field. And so if you're working remotely, you need to get to an office in the Northeast or Pacific Northwest, you're basically one of the only places that is equidistant and as easily accessible to those places as anywhere. But yeah, it's how does Fort Worth differentiate itself from Frisco having or Plano having Toyota and Frisco having all of these tech jobs coming in to get people here instead of there? Yeah, I feel like that's something we talk about a lot and try and figure out if we had an unlimited budget to market Fort Worth to the country, what would we use it for? Because it is, I feel like this next decade has a lot of opportunity of people having evaluated what they want from a work-life balance situation and figuring out where on the map best fits that for them.
I think the people who could maybe thrive or succeed in this next decade is them being very intentional on the thing you said about growth. I think we've learned what Austin, not what you said, Austin, and you even just kind of see people leaving San Francisco, people leaving California, and that's a beautiful state. I think being intentional on growth seems like a good core value on urban design.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple kind of follow-ups to your points there that I think are interesting. I'm certainly not saying Fort Worth should try to be Frisco.
Yeah.
I think, I think there's probably there are a lot of people that love living out in Frisco, but Fort Worth has a lot of things built in, cultural amenities, stockyards, downtown, those are in, urban neighborhoods. Those are amenities that people do want.
Yeah.
And so, leaning into that, and sort of those built-in amenities, I think can certainly bring some advantages. And then again, the San Francisco piece is interesting. Like you'll hear narratives around, oh, people are leaving San Francisco because they want to escape San Francisco. That's not really what's happening. San Francisco is really expensive because people really want to be there. and it, to the point that it's so expensive that a lot of people that want to be there, can't afford to live there anymore. And so, that's another one of those things where, again, just because people are leaving a place doesn't necessarily mean, that place is no longer desirable. And so
I love that point. I love the desire point.
Thinking about, it's a complicated thing. I study migration. I'm really interested in where people move around. And I remember, I gave a talk down in Austin a few years ago, and it was a talk actually on a totally different topic. And I had mentioned sort of offhand during the talk, I was interested in, studying where, how people decide where to live. And that was all I said. And so this guy comes up to me after the talk, the talk was about data visualization. And he comes up to me and he was really offended by what I said. And he said to me, people don't decide where they live. You have to understand it's structural factors that dictate that. And then so he starts going into the story of gentrification in Austin and the displacement of longtime residents in East Austin, which, that was something that really resonated with me, because I think it's, at the end of the day, I think it is a dialogue.
Yeah.
People make decisions within constraints, and some of us have more decision-making ability and fewer constraints, given, race, class, historical connections, what have you. And, some of us are more constrained and have fewer options. Ideally, that sort of loops back to that piece though, where, again, Fort Worth, if you think about population growth, there's that whole dynamic going on. All of these changes are reflecting some of those constraints, some of those decisions, but the goal, again, at all ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, you're hoping you can build a city that provides opportunity for all. And so, again, if you're thinking about, what I would love to see happen, certainly kind of population growth, I think generally a good thing, but, harnessed in a way that really builds a strong urban core and provides greater opportunity for the entirety of the population. That's what I would love to see, kind of with the city evolving moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you giving us your time. I feel like I was like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to cut these 4 things out. Can't talk about race. Can't talk about building the middle class. Can't talk about capitalism. So we're gonna have to cut all those things out and just keep it here. But it was great, and really appreciate it. We were looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for the time. I love talking about demographics and demographic change, and always like having that conversation. So
yeah, we'll definitely request maybe a part 2 down the road.
And absolutely,
and get more, because we usually do about 50-minute hour pods, but I have questions that could make another hour pod. So let's schedule another time.
Love to.
Awesome. Take care, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks.
You too.
There you have it. That was Kyle Walker, Associate Professor of Geography and Director of the Center for Urban Studies at Texas Christian University. We're going to have his new book, Analyzing U.S. Census Data, Methods, Maps, and Models in R, his forthcoming book with CRC Press, in the description. Check it out, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode, and we're excited to hopefully get Kyle back in future episodes. We're going to have more interviews along the way. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Also, even better if you could share with a friend. Let's keep the 817 community rocking as we built this lovely city called Fort Worth, Texas. Take care, everyone.
Swipe, dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe.